There are a number of co-researchers acknowledged in this because the paper is derived from 3 separately funded projects, 2 of which are funded by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation, and 1 of which is funded by the Australian Research Council's Discovery Award. So to talk a little bit first about the AU Kids Online project and the EU Kids Online project, which is the area of the research that was funded by the Centre of Excellence for Creative Industries and Innovation. I've been involved in this since 2006 when I was appointed to the International Advisory Panel, and in 2010 I got funding to run a parallel project in Australia from the Centre of Excellence. And we recruited the families in the same way that the European study had done, and that meant that it was done randomly through a process which involved electoral districts with 10 families per district. And so it's as close as we can get to a random sample, but of course when you're interviewing children and you have a matched parent with that child, the families themselves can say whether or not they're going to participate. So there's always this confounding factor which will stop it from being truly random. So it is selected from people that were willing to participate. And the families had to have children aged between 9 and 16. And they had to agree not only that the child could be interviewed separately, but the parent had to be in the house, but that one of the parents, the parent most involved with the child's internet use and supervising that, would also be interviewed. But the great thing about this was we could only afford to do 400. As you can imagine, with a country the size of Western Europe, to have a randomly chosen group of people and to be flying interviews out to every state and territory had at least 10 families in it. It was hugely expensive. So each recruited unit, as it were, was more than 4 times as expensive as the equivalent in Europe. But nonetheless, so we had 400 people in our group, but they compared alongside 25,000, because there were 25 countries with 1,000 children in each of them in Europe. And really, it came as the results came as quite a surprise to the researchers, including me, because what it showed was that Australian kids, compared to 25 European countries, were more likely to say that they were bothered by something they had encountered online in the previous 12 months, where we used the word bothered as a way that was defined as meaning made you feel uncomfortable, upset, or feel that you shouldn't have seen it. And it was 2.5 times more likely that an Australian child would say this than the equivalent child in Europe. There are other reasons. Australian children are particularly vocal, we think. They're more likely in tune with their feelings and their opinions, so it's possible that they're more willing to say, and to have opinions about these things than say, a child in, for example, Turkey or Estonia. But nonetheless, we tried to set this up as an equivalent study, and the equivalence, if we took that as the benchmark, the equivalence showed that Australian children were more likely to have been bothered. When we look at the 6 areas that we looked for whether or not children had been distressed or not, the areas in which we looked, and this is the areas in which our children were bothered in Australia, we noticed that it's things like misuse of children's personal data, children being bullied online, seeing sexual images, seeing potentially harmful user-generated material, sexting, and going to meet in person someone that you've only met online. Now, interestingly enough for us, as policy workers as well, it's only number 3, seeing sexual images, and number 6, going to meet a stranger, that the regulatory system and the legal system gets involved with. But I'll be arguing that actually, from children's point of view, it's often the troubling peer-based interactions that causes most distress. So parents and adults' views of what's dangerous and children's views of what upsets them are very different. This is one of the reasons, this chart explains why Australian children score so highly on being bothered. in the right-hand column, you'll see the relative severity of this area. So they were second out of 26 countries in saying that someone had misused their personal data. They were third out of 26 in saying that they'd been bullied online, and they were fourth out of 26 in saying they'd seen sexual images that had bothered them. I mean, some children, particularly in the older age group, 16, 3/4 of people who saw sexual images said that it hadn't bothered them. But in terms of the ones that had been bothered. And then there were 6 out of 26 in seeing potentially harmful user-generated. So that's things like anorexia websites, suicide websites, and tattoo, hate crimes and so forth. So when we asked children to respond to an open-ended space, and what happened was that some of these things that are more emotional, the interviewer was with the child all the time, but they would hand the computer over to the child and they wouldn't see what the child wrote. So the child would write something into the computer and then press the send button. So they were able, in a comparatively private way, to record what it was that had upset them. And we asked them to say, what do you think bothers people your age, before we gave the prompts about things like bullies and such like. So we've just been talking generally about their online interactions before we did that. And these are some of the examples. So I'll let you just have a look at those. This sense of the 15-year-old at the bottom about posting, giving people bad images about people which are not true and meant to be nasty so they lose friends. The issues about peer group and friendship networks are so germane to this age group and become more and more important as you move from 9 to 15 to 16, that these issues really weigh on the minds of young people. So that was the foundation study and gave us some of the quantitative data which we then wanted to investigate in a qualitative way. And the 2 projects that were subsequently funded, one was the Australian Research Council Discovery Grant, looking at parents and peers, and another was a follow-up, which was a comparative study again with 9 European countries, so we made the 10th. That research hasn't been published yet. The European research has been published, but not the comparative research from Australia, and that's hopefully coming out in October. The research that this paper is mainly based on is the discovery research, the qualitative research with parents and peers. And so that's based in Western Australia, and I have selected 3 case studies of examples of where parents and children both talk about troubling peer-based interactions. And so we can compare the parents' view of what's going on with what the child told the researcher. And I acknowledge here that the researcher that gathered this data is a woman called Dr. Danelle Holloway, and the 2 of us were, she was the paid research assistant on the project and is a co-author of the paper which most closely comes out of this, which is currently in the review process. The initial research design was somewhat confounded. The idea was to work with online fan fiction circles. If anyone knows a circle of teen online fan fiction writers that would like to be part of this research, we would love to speak to them, because we have found it hard to recruit. Partly because online fan fiction often has explicit sexual content, and the people that create it are often under the age of consent. It's very hard to persuade teenagers that this is non-judgmental, totally anonymous, and we're really interested in really the things that they're passionate about. So that they always look at it as, I do this to be subversive, I don't want to share it with the authority figures, which is understandable. Gaming, which we found more easy to recruit, and an additional active social network. This age group doesn't really use Facebook. Older people use Facebook these days. They're using sort of Skype and different social networks. So we're doing some work around that too. So the idea was to interview the teenager and the relevant parent, but because we were trying to get a group of collaborating teenagers, what used to happen was we would try and we'd recruit one person, they'd tell their friends, and then a conservative parent would say, well, what does the school think? And because the school hadn't been approached, they would say, oh, you're not allowed to, don't do that. And so the whole thing would fall over. So we then had to start going through schools, which is a whole different level of ethics applications. And they managed to, squash all the energy out of it. So in the end, we didn't get groups to start with. We now have managed to recruit a group of gamers in the UK, because there's a partner investigator in the UK. But this is based in the West Australia one. So none of these young people are in a group with each other, the ones that I'm about to talk about. So it's one-on-one in-depth interviews, children and parents interviewed separately, but again, because of ethics and other requirements, the parent was in the house at the time the child was being interviewed, and the interviewer had to have all sorts of relevant security checks, and the material was fully transcribed and then coded using a constant comparative approach and the principles of grounded theory. So we looked for themes in the material and then the theory from the themes. So the case study that I'd first like to talk about is Miralee, who's a mother of 4, and Sari, who is her oldest daughter. And so Miralee's concern is about the digital record and the persistence of the digital record. And she's also aware that she knows that Sari has had troubled online interactions, but she doesn't think that Sari would come to her parents. So she doesn't think she'd become involved because Sari would feel that involving a parent would make the issue bigger. And so it's Miralee's view that Sari has a lot of friends that would stand up for her. And so she's based some of these things in the things that Sari has said. So I'll let you read the italicized words there. So when we talk to Sari, one of the interesting things is that Sari points out that people are different online from what they are face to face. So she thinks, a broader social circle online, because there are people that she's friends with online that she doesn't talk to very much in the classroom herself, but she also has online the friends that she has in person. So her friendship group online is a bit different. And so she's a person who closes down conversation in response to feeling under threat. She says, I'd probably just try and get out of the conversation or not try to contact that person and just wait to see if they kept saying stuff or doing stuff. So when we started looking at this, so Sari's two perspectives, that parents are the last resort and schools aren't involved because online bullying occurs at home, which isn't actually what a lot of schools say. Schools are now taking responsibility for interactions that occur between members of their community, wherever they occur. But what it does is it throws Sari very much back on her personal social peer group resources. And one of the indications of that is that when she's saying, I'd rely on other people to tell me what's going on, or to help her, what it means is that people are recruited into these online and in-person interactions. And so the boundaries between what is and what isn't an aggressor and what is and what isn't a victim become much less clear, depending upon how the sides are drawn. And so this exchange indicates the complexity and nuance of online interplay and the possible value of parents communicating that they do see themselves as circuit breakers, because the fact that Sari locates the problems and the solutions in her peer group means that puts a huge emphasis upon young people and means that she's not really able to find a way to break that through. But parents don't get much support in this sense that they are able to negotiate with children, and unless they have strong communication around these issues. And particularly we find out that authoritative parenting styles, and we've written about this elsewhere, is often linked with poor communication. So children don't feel they trust their parents because they feel that if they get into a difficult situation, they'll be told off by their parents rather than supported by them. So case study 2 involves Susanna, the mother, and Patrick, her youngest son, whereas Sari was a trailblazer, Patrick is following the rest of his family. He doesn't use Facebook, he uses Skype to contact his friends, and they do quite a lot of online chatting with full vision. And he says, no, he hasn't been bullied, but then he goes on to describe something that other people might see as putting into the third person something that he actually knows a huge amount of information about. So he said, you know, one day I did get a threat from someone on Skype. I still don't know why. He's still my friend. And we learned later from his mother, from Patrick's mother, that actually he got punched by this guy. The person that threatened me and hurt me, his account got hacked. This sort of passive, you know, somehow his account got hacked. Someone hacked it and changed the password so he couldn't get back in. So you can see that would be a very frustrating thing to happen to, you know, someone who is 11 or 12. That you go to your email account and you can't get in because someone's hacked it and cut you out. It was someone he knew, says Patrick. It was a friend of someone he knew that didn't like him. They just changed his password, but he got it back. So we assume that Patrick knows a little bit more about this than just the passive third person. So his mother's comments about this said, Patrick told you about his experience with Skype, a bit of hassle going on. He blocked them. There was a bit of spillover at school, and it blew up. These two boys were good friends, and suddenly there was biffing and bullying. And I went to school, and the principal made them shake hands. It was a bit on both sides. So the mother's constructing this as, you know, perhaps even Stevens, but other people trying to understand a bullying incident might say, well, the trigger was this child finding himself locked out of his own account. This sense of, you know, the misuse of personal data that we identified as being particularly prevalent in Australia compared with 26 European countries. However, Susanna generally trusts her child and what's going on, and says, you know, I trust their judgment, a little bit worried about what Patrick might get up to when he gets older. And so the implication there almost is that she's more worried about what Patrick will see rather than his social circumstances. And interestingly, Australian parents generally do trust their children. And this is one of the things that when we were in an Australian policy environment, which we were a few years ago, where the Australian government was talking about compulsory filters and such like, of a really quite restrictive sort. They were going against all of the advice that we have and all of the research outputs which say that actually parents believe that children should have a sort of self-regulated exposure to material so that they learn what they can handle and they can get more resilient to it. And parents do trust their children most of the time. And they believe that even when they come across material that can trouble or disconcert them, that they can then develop the skills to be able to synthesize that. So when we look at Patrick's and Susanna's experience, we still have these issues about parental concern around whether they, parents, should be doing more to protect children and to overview online activity. And that although they do worry about bullying, is still back in this old system, that their primary concerns are around paedophiles and sexual content. And this is why, even though there's obviously been quite a specific bullying incident which actually had physical manifestations, the mother is just leaving that to one side and saying, oh, but I'm worried about the future. And she's worried about what he might see, where he might go online, and who he might meet online. So the case study 3, which was really very interesting to do. So Michelle, the mother, and Poppy, 19, a fan fiction writer who didn't talk about her fan fiction very much. So Michelle constructs Poppy as being a victim of a serious bullying incident and very shy online. So, you know, she had a Facebook account and was sort of using it with a few people. I encouraged her to start using Facebook, but she wouldn't put her friend request up for a while. She didn't have the confidence. We had a chat about it. After that, Facebook seemed to take off. And I'm not sure if it's a good or bad thing. Parents are often conflicted around Facebook because actually, because there's a 13 age limit, you shouldn't have a Facebook account under 13. But we know that over half of children in Australia do, even though they then stop using it. So half of under 13s have a Facebook account. It's often done because the parents have helped them get around those sort of blocks and put in false birthdays and things like that. So some of the kids that had bullied her, we went and looked at their Facebook accounts to find out what they were doing now. I think that's one of the reasons why she's very careful with the internet. She's a private person as well, so she's going on her terms. So we get this impression of a reasonably shy, retiring, tentative 16-year-old. We talked to Poppy. I have Facebook on, but it sits in the background in case someone sends me a message, but no one ever does. I watch YouTube videos and then I go onto 4chan. It's an image board, which is where people post images with text. It's not a very nice place. It's basically the people on 4chan, when they post without putting a name on it, which most people do, they show as anonymous. And so it calls itself the Internet Hate Machine, only because Fox News calls it that. They're normally just smart comments about anything. And she goes on to talk, I go on to talk a little bit about anonymous and the fact that they sort of set themselves up in sometimes, or full of a sort of an amorphous and somewhat anarchic group of individuals who sometimes involve themselves in sort of vigilante behaviour. So when Amanda Todd, at this age group, is very aware of, committed suicide as a result of online harassment due to a predator taking a photograph of her naked breasts and then chasing her in different communities around her life. They tried to out the person they believed was responsible for persecuting Todd, but they got the wrong person. So 4chan and Anonymous have this sort of edgy feel to them. But then we go back to Poppy's comments. You know, I have a 30-character password on many of my blogs, a fingerprint scan on my Facebook. I use an ID hider. It basically makes it look like Uzbekistan or something. It hides who I am. So this is a highly sophisticated 16-year-old internet user whose experience of being bullied has made her actually walk on a very, very sort of walk on the wild side of it on the internet. She's attracted to the very places that parents assume young people shouldn't be going in many ways. You can generally spot, and she's saying, I'm street smart on the web. You can spot the people that are going to be creepy. It's best to just assume that people are going to be creepy, because the chances are they are. I mean, this is the sort of street wisdom that children acquire when they want to go out and they want to explore the dark places, the darker places that parents are scared of. But instead, we see this person that's constructed by the parent as shy and retiring actually has huge confidence and a sense of presence in her online activities. But one of the things that I thought was quite interesting here was that although they have divergent views of Poppy's online, well, certainly the mother's view of what Poppy does online diverges from the research team's view of what Poppy does online, they actually connect quite closely. And one of the strategies that the mother said she had was that when Poppy was being bullied, she would take her for a drive. And interestingly enough, parents often try and confront teens by sitting opposite them around a table, whereas taking them for a drive means that you're not eyeballing them out, you're able to talk from a sort of sideways, and the child will often say much more when they don't have to stare at their parent when they're talking about it. We go for a special drive. Okay, so the conclusions, and this is the final content slide, so sorry if I've been taking up too much time. Troubling peer-based interactions can have significant repercussions across the years. Well, we know that. And they impact in unpredictable ways on young people's future uses of the internet. There is extensive publicity around certain aspects of online bullying, such as the Amanda Todd tragedy. And whilst parents have a role in negotiating these issues, we would argue that even a brief discussion can reveal complex sets of motivations, and that parents have to be really well connected with their children and communicating clearly to have a sense of that deep nuance that goes on, and that there's rarely a simple right and wrong or knee-jerk response to what's happened. So given the prevalence of troubling peer-based interactions, and as we saw, 3 potentially or more of the 6 things that mean that kids are bothered online in Australia. So misuse of personal data, access to user-generated content, bullying online. So many of those are linked to troubling peer-based interactions. It remains an issue of significant importance for society as a whole. You know, that bullying is a whole of society problem. It's not a school problem, it's not a parent problem, it's not a teen problem. It's part of the culture. And bullying and associated socially aggressive behaviours are everybody's business. And that's one reason why the 3,000 responses to the recent consultation around the possible inauguration of a Children's E-Safety Commissioner, which we still haven't had the report from, argues that the role should not be restricted to supporting children, but should be available to people of all ages. So questions, and those are the straightforward references.